Now, 1130 News Radio, Year in Review.
Someday books will be written about the April 28th federal election. In fact, one already has. Canada versus Donald Trump, the 51st state votes. Joining us for a special year-end edition of the News Radio Bookshelf is freelance journalist, columnist, and author Justin Ling. Welcome.
Hey, thanks for having me.
The name of the book is The 51st State Votes, but as you point out, the Trudeau government was in trouble long before Donald Trump was reelected, and certainly before the president mused about Canada becoming the 51st state. What led you to that conclusion? What do you think were the biggest issues at that point?
Yeah, I mean, coming into 2025, before you even start getting to the anxieties brought on by Donald Trump, something was amiss in this country, right? We phrased it a bunch of different ways. Canada is broken, maybe Canada is not broken, but in need of some remodeling. However you wanted to phrase it, I think there was this endemic belief that something was not quite working. And you can go down the list to illustrate that point, right? Housing is too expensive, and yet we can't build any of it. The civil service was bigger than ever, and yet it seemed to be delivering less and less. We were expecting this sort of broad Canadian solidarity coming out of the pandemic, and yet our politics seemed more polarized and divisive than ever, even at a time when the Prime Minister was talking about building back better and really getting Canada on its feet. It felt like everything he did was a stumble or a misstep. There was this pervasive feeling in the country that Trudeau was just wildly mismatched for where the public was, that he had bungled immigration and, big public works projects, that he didn't seem to have any, real ideology or intention left. Like, it really did feel like we had really kind of crashed into a brick wall to some degree and didn't know how to get ourselves over or around it. And that was before Donald Trump even won his election in November. So compounding all of the sort of existing malaise that we had, that, by the way, was kind of present everywhere else in Europe and the US and even some parts of Asia, but compounding that malaise with the existential threat coming from this reactionary president who was promising to annex us and maybe Panama and Greenland while he was at it, I think really lit a fire under people. And it can be hard to appreciate just how much stuff changed in such a short amount of time. I mean, starting this year, we were facing this reactionary president. The Prime Minister goes from saying he's never going to leave to announcing his sudden resignation to us having this breakneck leadership race and anointing Mark Carney as the new Prime Minister, to a new election that resulted in this near majority government. And that was just in the first quarter of the year, really. So a lot changed really, really quickly. And I know this book is really an attempt to sort of grapple with all of that and take stock of kind of where we've gotten in terms of dealing with those kind of fundamental issues that we were dealing with even last year.
There's a great line. There's many great lines in the book, but one of my favorite lines is upon interviewing Trudeau in 2024, you put it, and I guess you're paraphrasing Oscar Wilde, either he goes or this wallpaper does.
Yeah. It hit this point. I remember walking out of his offices in Langevin Block, and I walked into that room. I walked into that interview with the Prime Minister last summer, or last spring, I suppose. And I thought to myself, I have been talking to so many people around his government, past, present, boosters, detractors, and I just got this inescapable feeling that the Prime Minister and the people around him were just losing touch with reality. And I mean that in the sense that they didn't really know what the public wanted or what they were thinking. They didn't really know where the political winds were blowing. They didn't really have an appreciation for the degree to which the things they said they were doing were not actually coming to fruition. And we're in this sort of bunker where no facts could penetrate. And I walked into that room, into his office, these oak-paneled, historic offices in Langevin Block. And I thought to myself, this is the chance. It's here he'll convince me that, in fact, he still does have this sort of rational connection to reality. And that, in fact, maybe he is still the guy for the job. And I walked out of that room even more convinced than when I walked in that he had just completely, unchained himself from what was actually happening in the country. And it was pretty galling. Like, it was pretty intense, this feeling I had of, uh-oh, like, we're in trouble, right? Like, it's either this guy gets a clue or he takes off. Like, either he has to totally reshuffle his team and bring in some new blood, or he has to go, or else we're looking at this at a world where things are gonna keep getting worse. And even going into the fall of 2024, I know I was certainly thinking, as I think we're most Canadians, like, it really probably can't get much worse than this. Like, we're in danger we're in the red zone if costs keep going up, if productivity keeps going down, if our inability to build things gets worse, if the disconnect between, governor and governed gets wider, if the public keeps getting angrier. Like, we were really in that, to borrow a phrase from our current prime minister, that hinge moment that unless something changed, we were going to get into some really dicey waters. And, ultimately something did. It took a little while, but something did change. And, it's kind of hard to understate just how different of a moment we're living in right now versus even this time last year.
Well, it was just around this time last year, December 16th, when we saw Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland resign, viewed as many as the tipping point towards Justin Trudeau's resignation. But you argue that moment came months earlier.
Yeah. I mean, I think this government was falling apart at the seams, and Chrystia Freeland really did the coup de grace that finally put it out of its misery. But I mean, the successive by-election losses they had, where voters, trudged out to say, we're tired of this, please give us something else. Including in downtown Toronto, where a conservative was elected in a riding where a conservative had no business being elected, right? The overwhelming feeling of dread that I felt within the Liberal caucus of those who I was speaking to, the fleeing of senior staffers, including the campaign manager, Jeremy Broadhurst, who abruptly resigned and sort of said in no uncertain terms, I can't win this election for you, and I don't think anyone can. And so these are all the things that I think were really spelling the end of the Trudeau era. Chrystia Freeland was really the one to finally put her foot down and say, okay, someone has to tell you openly, transparently, with the full courage of their convictions, this isn't working for anyone. It is frustrating that it took us that long, right? I mean, you think our system, especially more than the American system or other Republican systems, that our system is supposed to be way more responsive to public disgruntlement, right? Like that is the fundamentals of the Westminster parliamentary system, that when the public really gets irate, when politicians realize that whether their own government or the government they set opposition from is not working, they use the power they have to either change the government or force an election. And it was really frustrating sitting around and realizing that system, that process wasn't working for months and months up until Freeland's eventual resignation. But it was really galling. I wrote a column in the Toronto Star last year where I quote, I cited a number of anonymous Liberal MPs and sort of even poked them in the eyes a bit and said, why are all of you telling us off the record that the Prime Minister can't stay and that the whole government is broken, but not one of you will actually stand up, represent your constituents and say, I was elected to govern effectively and we're no longer governing effectively, something has to change. So, I think a lot of this book also came out of this musing of, wow, our politics got really broken last year. And maybe the origin of that is a little earlier, but there was definitely this feeling in writing this book of, we really need to think long and hard about how we make sure that we never get into that kind of malaise again.
Now, we fast forward a bit. Justin Trudeau comes out of Rideau Cottage, I believe, announces his resignation pending a robust leadership selection process, which, as you mentioned, Carney walks away with. And then we have the election campaign. What did you make of Carney's campaign leading up to the 28th?
Yeah, so as you can read in the book, I spent about a week and a little more on Carney's campaign plane in the last week of the campaign. Prior to that, I did a lot of kind of crisscrossing, trying to intersect both the Liberal campaign, but also trying to chase around the Conservative campaign bus, which had not welcomed journalists on it, and showed up at the debates. Kind of did a little of kind of shoe leather reporting across the country. I think I crisscrossed the country twice over the course of the campaign, and spent a lot of times in rooms or in fields or in arenas with just kind of regular people. Many of whom I was chatting with basically said, I had never been involved in politics before, on both the conservative side and the liberal side. And I finally am inspired to do something because either I am so freaked out about the threat of Donald Trump, or I'm so frustrated with our inability to bring prices down or build homes or get government working again, or both. And it was, you could feel it pretty acutely that people wanted to be engaged and inspired, and that they had realized the damage done by years of sort of political malaise. I keep using that word, but I think it's the right one. And this is all reflected in the fact that this was the highest turnout election since 1993, right? Like, people were engaged. And what was really interesting is comparing and contrasting the two campaigns, right? Like, Pierre Poilievre went out there and ran the campaign they had been designing for 2 years. And it was just jarring how ill-suited for the moment it was, right? Like, to the point where, like, I even heard, real conservative supporters who would come out to these rallies walking away going like, wow, he really didn't deal with the Trump stuff very much. Like, wow, like, I'm kind of, I liked a lot of the stuff about, housing and youth and all this, but kind of fell a little flat. And then to go to a Mark Carney rally and just have this, and like, he's not an especially inspiring speaker, as I think everyone in this country knows, but to go into those rooms and to have people just genuinely excited, to have this kind of electricity in the room, and it compensated for him in this really fascinating way. I mean, he would get up on stage, and especially early in the campaign, and start going through remarks, and he would be kind of stilted. He wouldn't quite know when to stop for applause breaks. He had a hard time connecting with the audience. But what started happening over the course of the campaign is that his supporters, ranging from diehard liberals to people who had been Conservative Party members up until, 2025, you had these people who would come out to his rallies, and they would start offering him slogans. They would start finishing his sentences. They would start kind of singing along to his remarks to some degree. And for a certain type of politician, that would be incredibly destabilizing and frustrating. But for Mark Carney, who does not naturally sort of have the gift of gab, it was this weird sort of quasi-populist shot in the arm. It felt like he was bringing in random people to his rallies and his campaign in a big way. And it really compensated for the fact that he's just not naturally that kind of politician. And it was really fascinating to watch. I mean, it imbued his campaign with this sort of energy that I don't think anyone was counting on. And they used it pretty effectively. I mean, that's a campaign that realized how it could adapt mid-flight, and did so, I think, to clearly quite enormous success.
And you point out during the debates that the differences between Carney and Poilievre really shone through. Carney showing Canadians he was the hyper-competent manager they vaguely remembered from the 2008 financial crisis, while Poilievre's personal popularity was sliding. The more Canadians saw him, the less they liked him. Ouch.
Well, the book is hard on Pierre Poilievre, but it also underscores the promise and the potential he had that he squandered. And I think that's part of the reason I'm so hard on him. I mean, here's a politician who I've covered in various forms for more than a decade. I remember covering him when he was Minister of State for Democratic Reform, way back under the Harper government. And he's a guy who I've always found unbelievably smart, unbelievably hardworking, a guy who has a clear sort of North Star for what he wants to do, and does not really care what other people think he ought to do. And that can be a huge asset in politics. I mean, that is the sort of thing that drove him to care so deeply and to push so strongly on issues around affordability, especially for youth, on issues that affect blue-collar workers, on really picking up on that undercurrent of disgruntlement in Alberta. These are some things that I don't think were a natural fit for the conservative leader, right? If a conservative staffer a couple of years ago would have said, we need to focus on winning over youth votes, they probably would have been laughed out of the room. But that's what Pierre Poilievre did, and he ended up doing so relatively effectively. But here's the problem with Pierre Poilievre. Like I said, they designed a campaign 2 years ago, and they were loath to get rid of it. They designed a campaign to run against Justin Trudeau. And even when they weren't running against Justin Trudeau, they ran the same campaign anyway. They crossed out his name and wrote in Mark Carney. And it was a huge mistake. They designed a campaign to say, we need to win by activating non-voters, by peeling away diehard supporters of Maxime Bernier's People's Party, and maybe to hive off a small number of youth voters and union workers and some other people disgruntled with the Liberal government. It was never a plan to win 50% of the electorate. It was a plan to win 35, 36, 37% and split the vote so effectively that they managed to eke out a strong minority or a majority government, right? And that's a kind of cynical political strategy to begin with, but whatever, that's the system we live in. But the problem is that campaign does not work when people are genuinely fearful about the future of the economy, not just in a kind of short-term, I can't afford my groceries kind of way, but in a long-term, I'm worried that our entire industrial sector is going to be taken out at the knees. And also, by the way, I can't afford my groceries, right? That is a very different emotional climate than the one he was preparing for. And when in that emotional climate, people are on the hunt for a leader who just exudes competence, who they can trust on day one, can sit down with the unpredictable president of the U.S., but also the head of the EU, and also the president of Japan, and also the premier of China. They want to believe that the person they're electing is capable of managing all that and 100 other things. And when Pierre Poilievre spent so much time in this campaign yammering on about this sort of conspiratorial effort to import a million immigrants and whining and whinging on about the World Economic Forum and accusing the Liberals of wanting to force us all to eat bugs and spending his time speaking to Jordan B. Peterson. I think a lot of people looked at that and went, what are you doing? In this moment, how are these your priorities? And I think that for a lot of people really soured them on him, and I think continues to sour them on him. And he just really has not figured out how to pivot away from the version of himself he constructed a couple of years ago into something that actually inspires competence, confidence, and optimism from regular people.
Now, the book was finished by Canada Day. What conclusions would you draw now as we speak here in mid-December?
Yeah, I'm just finishing up my year-end column for the Toronto Star, and I've been thinking through this a lot. And it's, maybe I'm just kind of stuck in my ways, but I think the sort of conclusions I come to at the end of the book are even more relevant now than they were then. Mark Carney ran a brilliant campaign despite not being much of a campaigner. He is a singular sort of organizational, institutionalist kind of talent who understands how systems work and how they need to be kind of directed and managed. But, and here's the huge caveat, he has inherited a political party and a government that is not his. He has sort of failed to remake it in his image. He doesn't seem to care very much about bringing in the public, especially in the same way he did during the campaign. He doesn't really want to justify his actions or explain himself very often. He is clearly not very good at managing the egos in his own party and cabinet. Just look at the resignation of Stephen Guilbeault just a few weeks ago. I think there's these huge pitfalls coming up ahead of him where if he is incapable of bringing along his own cabinet, his own caucus, never mind the whole country, through some times that are going to be really tough. I don't know how he has the political capital to do the massive things he needs to do, right? Like getting this pipeline MOU done, getting BC and the affected First Nations and also the ecologists and environmentalists in his own party on board for a pipeline project that seems to tick all the boxes for Danielle Smith, that's going to be really hard. Never mind justifying the long-term massive defense spending necessary to get our military recapitalized, especially at a time when we could be looking to cuts for, services and programs big and small, trying to allay concerns as we face the real possibility of recession and sectoral depression thanks to Donald Trump's continuing trade wars, especially as he fails to get a deal, especially as we risk seeing the North American Free Trade Act get torn up or destroyed by the president. Going through all of those things is doable, but only if you have the wind at your sails that comes from having a unified party, a unified cabinet, and public trust. And I'll just I'll leave you with this. I've been reading through Mark Carney's book Values again as I'm thinking through kind of the state of his government. And he paraphrases this Indian government official who says, trust grows with the speed of a coconut tree and then falls with the speed of a coconut. And I thought that was a really clever little line that I think he ought to kind of remember as he goes forward, because he bought himself a tremendous amount of goodwill over the year 2025. And now that we're heading into some really, choppy waters, he risks losing that trust really quickly and really severely unless he can figure out a way to really kind of bring people along and to instill that same kind of confidence that he did during the campaign.
We should mention Pierre Poilievre facing a leadership review in the new year. How do you think that will go?
I think he's going to pass it with flying colors. I don't think he'll get the sort of Kim Jong-un 99% that he probably wants. But I think he's probably looking at high 70s to mid 80s. The party remains really confident that he can keep doing this. And in fairness, they see in him the sort of positive attributes that I was talking about earlier. Like they see the guy who correctly diagnosed the affordability crisis when he did. They see the guy who wants to unlock massive housing construction. They see the guy who, really wants to figure out how to tackle, whether it's urban decay or the scourge of homelessness or the tainted drug crisis, right? Like you can bicker about whether or not his solutions are the right ones, but he's the guy who has been correctly pointing out real things that make people worried and anxious, and in many ways are more pertinent to their daily lives than even Donald Trump's trade war. And because that really was the binary of the election, right? Like, are you more worried about the issues in your community, or are you more worried about the issues emanating from down south? And those who went in the former camp voted for Pierre Poilievre, and the latter voted for Mark Carney. So I think he does fine. I think he stays on as leader. But also, he refuses to change, like I said. And that will eventually provoke more unrest. I mean, you've already seen one floor crossing. You saw a second instance of one of his MPs who basically packed up and said, I can't do this anymore, just months after getting elected. And I think you're going to see more. Like some of his MPs do not appreciate being slapped around and treated like lesser. And that's kind of his style. So he's going to be okay in the short term, but I think there's a lot of medium-term challenges that suggest that Pierre Poilievre, is going to have to either change or gamble and either hope that he can eke out a victory or risk never, getting the job he's always wanted, which is Prime Minister of Canada.
Let's leave it there. The name of the book is Canada versus Donald Trump, the 51st State Votes. It's available from Sutherland House. My thanks to freelance journalist, columnist, and author Justin Ling.
Thanks so much.